Section 1 of Early Greek Philosophy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D. Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. Chapter 1. The School of Miletus, Part 1. 1. The meaning of philosophy. It is related of an old Greek sage that on being asked to explain what was meant by philosophy, he replied, "Life is like a public festival. Some go there to buy and sell. Others go to compete in the games. But a third class goes simply to look on, and these are the best of all." Well, just in the same way, most men are born slaves to the pursuit of gain or glory, whereas the philosopher freely devotes himself to the study of truth. This idea of philosophy as disinterested speculation has been handed down from the Greeks to ourselves, and has even been widely popularized, as common language seems to prove. Anyone who shows a great curiosity about things in general, apart from their utility to himself, any student who, like the young Francis Bacon, takes all knowledge for his province, is apt to be called a philosopher, while conversely he who has gained the reputation of being a philosopher is expected to know everything, not merely everything that is known already, but everything that ever will be known, and some things that perhaps cannot be known at all. Even popular language, however, is dimly conscious of a distinction between the philosopher and the scholar. Broadly speaking, the one is expected to know all about nature, the other is expected to know all about history and literature. Even his warmest admirers would hardly have called Mr. Gladstone a philosopher, while it might have excited some surprise if any recorded deed or word of any human being, from the creation down to the most modern times, had escaped his notice. On the other hand, it seemed quite in character that the typical philosopher, Herbert Spencer, should be rather proud of not knowing the date of something that happened 3 centuries ago, and that he should congratulate himself on not having received a classical education. Among the Greeks also, philosophy was associated in a peculiar manner with the study of nature as distinguished from the study of history and literature, which are more the subjects of what we call scholarship and erudition. And this fact explains how the word philosophy itself came into being. Originally, all men who were particularly distinguished for the extent of their knowledge, poets among others, went by the name of sophoi, the nearest English equivalent to which is wise, although wisdom with us seems more limited to knowing what is useful for the conduct of life than what a Greek meant by sophia. Now, in a relatively simple state of society, to know all that can be known about literature, history, and human interests generally seems a not impossible or inordinate ambition. It is otherwise with nature. True, the Greeks, as compared with ourselves, had hardly an idea of the vastness and complexity of the physical universe. Still, such acute and sincere observers could not fail to perceive, when they set their minds to it, how infinitely greater is the world of nature than the world of man. And so it came about that those who took nature rather than man for their province disclaimed the title of wise or knowing men, modestly preferring to be called lovers of knowledge, or, as we now say, students, which is precisely what is meant by philosophers. We are told that the first to adopt the name was the celebrated Pythagoras, who is also credited with the definition of philosophy as disinterested speculation, quoted at the beginning of this book. But it seems likely that both the word and definition belong to a somewhat later age than that in which Pythagoras lived. 2. Greek religion. Before philosophy arose, Greek curiosity about the origin and structure of the material universe was satisfied by an elaborate system of mythology. It is still a matter of dispute how religion first began, but it seems to be generally agreed that all the progressive races have passed through a stage in which their gods are conceived as personified natural objects or natural forces. At any rate, that was how the Greeks represented to themselves the beings whom they worshipped. Working, as we may suppose, on a mass of loose and discordant traditions, their poets elaborated the figments of popular religion into a literary scheme of such unfading interest that an acquaintance with Greek mythology has remained part of a liberal education all over the modern Christian world. It was a unique circumstance in the history of religion that the Greek poets should play such a decisive part in the evolution of theological belief. That the poets were able to exercise this commanding influence over public opinion arose from the absence among the Greeks of a priestly caste or corporation like those which dominated the great Oriental civilizations. Priests as a class abounded, but they were neither united nor powerful. Each particular sanctuary had its priest, claiming special knowledge of the god to whom it belonged, ready to explain how the favour of that particular divinity could be won or his anger appeased, able perhaps also to tell the legend of the sanctuary, the particular circumstances in which the god came to settle at that place. And even in very ancient times, Greek armies on a campaign were attended by soothsayers, whom the generals consulted in reference to any great calamity or any striking apparition presumed to be of supernatural origin. But these officials, although habitually treated with great respect, had no more than a personal authority. Neither priests nor soothsayers belonged to an order possessing the enormous wealth and political influence of the Babylonian or Egyptian hierocracies, or of the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. Assuming intellectual curiosity and intellectual progress to be good things, it was fortunate for the Greek mind that traditional beliefs had no stronger support than the ordinary conservatism of human nature, that they were not bound up with the material interests of a body accustomed to identify the truth of their opinions about the gods with the preservation of their corporate property. Greek mythology, in a systematized form, was, as I have said, a creation of the poets, and more particularly of Homer and Hesiod. With Hesiod, the conception of the gods as nature powers is quite evident. Homer presents them more as personal beings, but with him also evidence of their purely physical origin and nature is never far to seek. Zeus constantly appears as the cloud collector, that is, the upper heaven. Athena bears the aegis or cloud shield of her father Zeus. Apollo, his son, the far darter, is distinguished by the unmistakable attributes of a solar deity. And there seems to be a latent consciousness, at least in what are supposed to be the more recent portions of the Iliad, not only that the Olympian gods are nature powers, but also that they have no existence except as indwelling spirits of nature. Their detachment from material objects, the conception of them as self-conscious personal beings, is of course most complete when they are brought together in conclave for purposes of deliberation or festivity. Now it is just on those occasions that Homer takes his gods and goddesses least seriously, presenting them even in a ludicrous light, with a certain sceptical irony. Nature is not moral, and the gods of Greek poetry are neither exhibited as themselves models of good conduct, nor as necessarily encouraging good conduct among mortals. In fact, they behave as men and women might be expected to behave if they lived forever and were clothed with irresistible power. Their life among themselves is that of a dissolute aristocracy. Their treatment of the human race is determined by the frankest favoritism. An organized priesthood would not have tolerated such undignified proceedings in the objects of its worship as Homer reports. At the same time, in default of a priesthood, better even in some ways than a priesthood, public opinion among the Greeks did something to moralize religion. The gods were supposed to govern human affairs, and rulers, whether real or imaginary, cannot but become associated to some extent with ideas of justice. They became more particularly associated with the keeping of promises, which is the very foundation of social order, by the Greek custom of invoking them as witnesses to oaths. For to break an oath which a god had witnessed was, as the Decalogue puts it, taking his name in vain, conduct which he naturally resented. Moreover, Zeus, the supreme god, father of gods and men, was regarded as being in a particular way the patron of destitute persons and of strangers. At the same time, it must not be supposed that morality ever became so completely identified with religion in Greece as in ancient Israel or among Christian nations. And to the fact of their distinction is due the constitution of an independent moral philosophy by the early Greek thinkers, perhaps also the constitution of an independent physical philosophy as well. End of section 1. Section 2 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. The School of Miletus, Part 2. 3. The Seven Sages. In an early stage of civilization, people are saved the trouble of thinking about moral philosophy or abstract principles of right conduct by learning the laws and customs of their land or tribe, just as mythology saves them the trouble of finding scientific explanations of natural processes. But where a number of petty states exist side by side, each with laws of its own, where repeated changes of government involve the necessity of making new laws, above all, where the individual members of the community have so far emancipated themselves from the yoke of custom as to exercise a certain discretion in the management of their private affairs, there a sort of moral rationalism will arise, an idea that certain things should be done because they are good in themselves, not because they are prescribed by authority. These conditions were fulfilled to a remarkable extent in the Hellenic world during the first half of the 6th century BC. The old patriarchal monarchies, such as we find still existing in Homer's time, had given place to aristocratic republics, and in many instances one of the aristocrats had succeeded for a time in making himself what the Greeks called a tyrant or absolute ruler, by playing off the people against the nobles. Men who formerly occupied a leading position in their own city were driven into exile, and spent their enforced leisure in visiting foreign parts and studying the varieties of human life there offered to their observation. A vast extension of commerce brought the Greek mind into the vivifying contact with the great Oriental civilizations, and with the uncivilized inhabitants of northern Europe. Moreover, the economical revolution brought with it unexpected changes of fortune and new valuations of personal worth. It came to be a popular saying that money makes the man, long descent counting for little or nothing when the hereditary magnate had lost his paternal estates. It was in these circumstances that a group of worthies became widely celebrated under the name of the Seven Sages of Greece. Each sage got the credit of having originated some pithy saying which thenceforward became a current coin in the treasure of popular wisdom. What strikes us most about these adages is their brevity and the abstract wording that distinguishes them from the proverbs of other nations. Some of them had the glory of being inscribed on the walls of the temple at Delphi, and two in particular are pregnant with a wisdom that the highest Greek ethical teaching did but expand and apply. These are be moderate, and know thyself. To realize and practice the duties they recommend was to possess in its fullness what was par excellence the Greek virtue of sophrosyney. We ordinarily render the word by temperance. But temperance, even in the wide sense of avoiding excess in every direction, fails to convey its full meaning. For he to whom nature or training has given sophrosyney adds the faculty of self-knowledge to the faculty of self-control. He is what artists call the master of his means. He has learned what he can do, and does it. Something tells him how far he can go. Up to that point he goes, but not a step beyond. Opposed to sophrosyney as the ideal Greek virtue was what one may call the ideal Greek vice, in the sense of what wise Greeks most abhorred, that is, hubris. Literally, hubris means no more than excess, and some trace of this significance survives in our word hybrid, used primarily of animals that are a cross between two species, thus, as it were, exceeding the limits assigned to them by nature. Morally and etymologically, hubris is also connected with the word outrage, which literally means no more than going beyond, that is, beyond what reason and law prescribe, but which in the evolution of language has come to mean going beyond the bounds of ordinary license and crime. The Greeks, as a dignified and self-respecting people, were peculiarly sensitive to all such transgressions, from insolent and overbearing language to acts of unprovoked and gross personal violence committed in the mere wantonness of irresistible power. Nature, as they conceived her, is bound by strict laws of limitation, and therefore the gods, being nature powers, showed themselves particularly hostile to hubris, and the poetic interpretations of mythology all went to show that the old kingly races had perished by drawing down divine vengeance on their parricidal crimes or on their incestuous loves. In historic times the same feeling was particularly directed against the outrageous abuses of power committed by tyrants on the one side and by unbridled democracies on the other. As a mean between these two extremes, aristocracy found most favour with thinking men, while if a democracy had become firmly established, they looked to the middle class as the best guardian of social order against the turbulence of the nobles or of the people. 4. The reign of law. I have said that the Greeks conceived nature as bound by a law of limitation. This conception is so closely connected with their habits of political self-government, with the fact that their cities were constituted as free republics, each jealously guarding its independence against all the others, that we cannot tell which came first, the political organization or the creed. At any rate, that their republican habits led to the philosophical idea of nature as a self-sufficing orderly universe, developed on impersonal lines, undisturbed by the arbitrary volitions of supernatural beings, seems likely. An Oriental brought up on traditions of personal government could not easily grasp that idea, could not but conceive the material world as subject, like himself, to the will of an irresponsible master. And even the few self-governing Semitic communities remain subject in religion to priesthoods that preserve the tradition of a celestial autocrat intact. The Greeks, as we saw, had no such priesthood, and therefore their high intelligence was left free to work out a truly scientific philosophy of nature. In positive science, on the other hand, Greece was much behind the great Oriental theocracies. These had long promoted the study of arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, although more as adjuncts to magic and religion than from pure speculative curiosity. Such curiosity was, as we have seen, the characteristic note of philosophy, and it is a signal merit of the early Greek thinkers that they should have known how to carry away what was really valuable in Eastern learning, while discarding nearly the whole of the superstition in which it was embedded. 5. Thales. Among the 7 sages of Greece, Solon of Athens has remained through all ages the most celebrated for practical genius, and many who would be puzzled to tell when or where he lived have heard of him as an ideally wise man. To those, however, who are not studying the history of politics, but the history of thought, the most interesting of the whole band is not Solon, but Thales of Miletus, the founder of Greek and indeed of all European philosophy. It is no accident that this wonderful man should have been a Milesian. At the time when he flourished, that is to say, early in the 6th century BC, Miletus was the most prosperous of the Ionian cities in Asia Minor, and the Ionians stood intellectually at the head of the whole Hellenic race, the furthest removed from primitive barbarism, the least exposed to contagion from the contemporary barbarism that surrounded Hellas like a sea on every side. We know that religious scepticism began at a comparatively early date among the Ionian Greeks, for those parts of the Homeric poems where the gods are exhibited in a rather ridiculous light, although among the latest additions to the original epic, are still very ancient, and these are evidently the work of an Ionian hand. It only remained to substitute a serious scientific explanation of the world for the discredited Olympian mythology, and this was first attempted in the school of Miletus. Thales was not a writer of books, and what we know about him comes from reports of which the earliest cannot be dated nearer than half a century after his death, while the most important information of all comes from Aristotle, who lived not much less than 2½ centuries later than his time. But it all seems credible enough, and on putting these scattered notices together, we reach the conception of Thales as a true master of those who know, combining great practical sagacity with a firm grasp of scientific realities, so far as they were then accessible, and an instinctive feeling out after that universality which alone can lift positive science to the supreme heights of synthetic philosophy. He is credited with having discovered certain elementary propositions of geometry: that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, and that if 2 straight lines intersect, the opposite angles are equal. Anyone can see by looking at the figures that the fact is so. Perhaps Thales first proved that it must be so. And he is also stated on good authority to have predicted an eclipse of the sun, which the calculations of modern astronomy show to have occurred in the year 585 BC. Apparently Thales owed his place among the 7 sages to that lucky forecast. I say lucky, because at that time astronomers knew no more than that eclipses recur at certain intervals. They were unable to tell whether a particular eclipse would be visible on a certain part of the earth's surface or not. Thales no doubt ascertained by studying the tables drawn up by Babylonian astrologers that a solar eclipse would be visible somewhere or other that year. By good fortune, not only was it visible in Asia Minor, but it also fell on the day of a great battle between the Lydians and the Medes, so alarming the combatants that they separated and made peace. So much for Thales as a man of science. As a philosopher he taught that water is the principle of all things, or what we should call the fundamental element. It was a Semitic idea, quite familiar to us from the earlier chapters of Genesis, that the earth is surrounded by water on all sides, being protected against an inflooding of the great deep below by its own solid structure, and against eruptions from above by the solid vault of heaven, a notion whence our word firmament is derived. In like manner, modern science conceives the earth and all the heavenly bodies as surrounded by a vast sea of ether, the medium by whose pulsations light, heat, electricity, and perhaps even gravitation are constituted and transmitted. Now the idea has been gaining ground for some years past that matter is made out of ether, was originally evolved from ethereal particles or pulses, and is perhaps destined to resolve itself into them again. And it would seem that Thales came to the same conclusion about the derivation of all things from water by a more summary process than modern science would approve of, but in a spirit closely akin to that of our own most advanced physical investigations, the generalizing, assimilating spirit so characteristic of philosophy in every age. Another recorded saying of the Milesian pioneer points in the same direction: all things are full of gods. Here at first sight we seem to have the old mythology back again, to be no further advanced than Hesiod was when he represented the great cosmic powers as personal beings, marrying, begetting children, and quarrelling with one another. If, however, we take the words in connection with the general drift of his teaching, they acquire another meaning. Had the citizens of a Greek republic been addressed as so many kings, they would none the less have represented a realm of law and order as against the personal despotisms of the East. And so, when Thales said that there was a god in amber, or a god in the lodestone, he really meant that the drifting cloud and the falling thunderbolt belong to the same world of natural occurrences as the phenomena, then first beginning to be scientifically observed, of magnetism and electricity. End of section 2. Section 3 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. The School of Miletus, Part 3. 6. Anaximander. I have said that Thales probably learned what astronomy he knew from Babylon, and that his view of the relation between earth and water was Semitic. Now it is certain that the philosopher was not of pure Greek race, and one rather doubtful pedigree even makes him belong to a Phoenician, that is to say, a Semitic family. There seems to be very insufficient grounds for the belief, but were it true, philosophy would remain a product of European, not of Asiatic culture, while the fertilizing stimulus that first started Greek thought seems to have come not from any Semitic source, but from Egypt. At any rate, the beginnings of speculation at Miletus coincide with the permanent establishment of a Milesian colony at Naucratis in the Delta, a concession due to the liberality of the very enlightened Pharaoh Amasis. With Anaximander, the pupil of Thales, and like him a Milesian, born 610 B.C., we already stand on more solid ground. This marvellous thinker may be called the second founder of philosophy, for he first gave it literary expression in a book of which some fragments still survive. According to him, the primary substance whence all things arise is not water, nor indeed any form of matter known to us, but an infinite something without limit in space or time. Out of this all the worlds are evolved by a necessary process of succession, and into it they return when their fated term of existence is completed. Only so, as Anaximander thinks, can the eternal laws of justice be fulfilled. No single combination of material conditions among the boundless possibilities of existence has a right to continue forever, blocking the way that others also are waiting to traverse in their turn. Here we have the cardinal Greek virtue of sophrosony, the Ionian rule of self-limitation, raised to the dignity of a universal law determining the life and death of things in themselves. There is no room in Anaximander's system for the immortal gods of Homer. Each world in the infinite succession of worlds is a god indeed, but a god destined to perish like ourselves. Like Thales, Anaximander has a place in the history of science no less than in the history of philosophy, perhaps even a greater place. We are told that he made the first map, and that he conceived the earth as hanging unsupported in space, although he did not conceive it as a globe, but as a cylinder. This, however, marks a considerable advance on his master's view of the earth as a flat disk floating on the water. According to him, the heavenly bodies are vast revolving hoops of fire, pierced with circular apertures, which give us the notion of them as luminous disks. And he anticipated the nebular hypothesis so far as to teach that these hoops were evolved out of the formless infinite by a process of gradual differentiation. Evolution was an idea familiar to all the early Greek philosophers. It presents indeed no difficulties to men at a much more primitive stage of thought than theirs. We ourselves have grown up gradually from very small beginnings, and the natural thing is to conceive the world as having been developed in the same fashion. Moreover, primitive folk are accustomed to look on the transformation of men into animals or plants, and of animals or plants into men, as quite an ordinary occurrence. It is not therefore surprising to find Anaximander saying that land animals were originally developed from aquatic or fish-like animals, and that man was born from animals of a different species. The remarkable thing is the reason he gives for this theory. While other animals quickly find food for themselves, man alone requires a prolonged period of suckling. Hence, had he been originally such as he is now, he could never have survived. 7. Anaximenes. We shall see presently what causes brought the genuinely scientific movement of the Milesian school to an end. Before expiring, it produced one more great representative in Anaximenes, the successor of Anaximander. With less speculative daring, he seems to show a closer observation of fact. For him also there is a primal substance of infinite extent, in which and from which all finite things have their being. That elementary substance is air, the air that we breathe, our very life. To use his own words, that which is our sole and constitutive principle also holds the universe together. A philosopher who so expressed himself now, or indeed at any time after Plato, would be properly called a materialist. But we can hardly apply the name to Anaximenes. Materialism and spiritualism are a correlated couple. Each term first becomes intelligible as the antithesis and contradiction of the other. We have better grounds for crediting Anaximenes with what would now be called a mechanical theory of nature, as distinguished from what, by another modernism, may be described as the specific energies or occult qualities of his predecessor. Anaximander taught that such antithetical pairs as wet and dry, hot and cold, etc., were separated out or differentiated from the homogeneous infinite, where they had previously existed in a latent state. To Anaximenes, on the other hand, heat and cold, like the solid, liquid, and gaseous states of matter, were all merely so many products of rarefaction and condensation. Air squeezed together becomes cloudy vapour. Under additional pressure, vapour turned to rain, and rain by the same process to vegetable and animal substances, which ultimately pass into air again. Observing with perfect accuracy that heat and cold are somehow connected with dilatation and compression, this early precursor of Bacon unfortunately reversed the real relation by supposing that air is chilled by being condensed and warmed by being expanded. And that is why, says Anaximenes, we press our lips together when we want to blow cold, and open them when we want to blow hot. In studying the errors of such a man, we must remember that to ask questions and answer them wrongly helps progress incomparably more than not to ask them at all. "Good care is taken," says a German proverb, "that the trees shall not grow into the sky." Milesian philosophy, with its splendid promise of positive knowledge, perished after the third generation, first choked by rank undergrowths of superstition, then uprooted by earthquake and storm. But the same causes that put an end to speculation in one part of Hellas favoured its rise and propagation from new centres of intelligence elsewhere. It was just this multiplication of intellectual centres, leading to the cross-fertilization of mental growths, that gave the Greek genius such an extraordinary productivity, a productivity of which the world's history affords no second example. End of section 3.